Goblin Slayer may not have a name, but he does have a backstory, and it fully explains why he takes so much pleasure in killing these little green bastards. Greetings, my friends, it's time for another bloody, macabre, and monster-filled episode of Goblin Slayer, an episode which delves deeply into his backstory, showing us why he has such a deep hatred of goblins, and of course, it's all about a story of revenge. What is most interesting about this episode right here is not only do they finally start to introduce some new characters, but just like the first episode, none of the characters really have a name. It's still the Goblin Slayer and the Priestess, and they actually managed to introduce a brand new female character who is the childhood friend of Goblin Slayer. I don't know what her name is. The only thing that's really distinctive about her is that she's incredibly nice, very cute, and has very big eyes. Who am I kidding? This chick is absolutely stacked, and she's actually pretty integral to Goblin Slayer's backstory. Apparently, when he was younger, he was living with his parents and a couple of friends in this small village, which was eventually ransacked and absolutely burnt to the ground by a group of goblins. Luckily, his childhood friend was in the city at the time, and she actually managed to survive thanks to her uncle. However, this began the vendetta against the goblins themselves. Not only was his family and friends killed, but he was left with no one, and thus he had the declaration that he was going to kill every single goblin, no matter what it takes. This episode does a pretty good job of showing what happens when someone gets obsessed with revenge to the point where it controls their entire life. Goblin Slayer is an adventurer because he wants to be, not because he wants to be some grand hero. He's doing it all out of revenge. The good thing is Goblin Slayer will still not be alone on his quest. It looks like the Priestess is still going to be joining him on some missions, reluctantly even so, knowing that they don't have the opportunity to save everyone from goblins, but she doesn't necessarily want this guy to go in alone, despite the fact that he's clearly a specialist at fucking these little things up. I'd say the most effective scene of the episode is when Goblin Slayer and Priestess actually go to this goblin hideout where they actually end up burning it to the ground, and Priestess is able to use a brand new ability which puts up this light wall in front of all of the entrances of this tree, and they basically just roast them from the inside, essentially transforming this giant hideout into just a big freaking oven. And what I especially love about this entire scene is how Goblin Slayer basically equates himself to the human equivalent of a goblin. He's basically everything that he hates. It's pretty freaking awesome in all sorts of metal, but really that's kind of the entire episode, aside from a few scenes of watching his childhood friend desperately wait at her farm for the arrival of Goblin Slayer. It's very obvious that she seems to have some sort of feelings for him, but doesn't really know how to fully express them, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that the Goblin Slayer himself, while still being a human, has sort of lost himself to his revenge. He's basically transformed into another being altogether, but still manages to have a human heart and wants to actually save people, even if he knows he can't save everyone. As long as it means he can kill some goblins, it's something that he is totally going to be down for. But one of the most interesting things about this episode is that we get an intro, which is all sorts of awesome, and we even get the introduction of a brand new character in a post-credit scene at the very end of the episode. The intro and the ending indicates that eventually Goblin Slayer and Priestess are going to be joined by some other adventurers, and they're going to form some sort of party, and this is probably going to delve a little bit deeper into what the actual story of Goblin Slayer is going to be. I think it's going to evolve a little further than just killing goblins, and I think there's going to be a much bigger story here, and I can't wait to see how it's all going to play out. In fact, the character who appears at the end of the episode is some sort of elf archer who is joined by some older gentleman and some sort of weird big lizard dude. I don't know what it is with these characters, but I love the designs of them. They're really distinctive, and they go in line with Goblin Slayer himself. And I love the introduction to them because we have this scene of this like old school sort of fantasy minstrel who's singing a song about Goblin Slayer and all of the amazing things that he's done. But this archer really wants to meet the Goblin Slayer, and I can't wait to see why that is. They either want help from him, or maybe there's something we still don't know quite about his backstory. It is also worth mentioning that in the actual like flashback at the beginning of the episode of seeing a younger Goblin Slayer, we don't really get to see what he fully looks like, just that he was a young boy, and it does officially confirm that he was human. I had a theory in my previous episode that he might not be human because he's completely obscured by his armor, and maybe he even could be like a goblin or a monster or something himself, but no, it's pretty clear that he is human by this episode right here. So it all ends with a great cliffhanger of more to come. So what's the rundown on this episode of Goblin Slayer? Kind of a slow episode, but one that I really found myself enjoying a lot of it for its intense atmosphere. They also didn't waste any time in letting the viewer know that this episode was going to be just as violent and fucked up as the previous, with the big warning that popped in at the very beginning of this episode, which I don't believe was actually in the very first episode at all, and that's probably why the first episode was so shocking to me in the first place. But now I know that these things are going to happen, so I fully expect it, and a lot of that is definitely going on in this episode right here. They continue to paint the goblins as these absolute, just demonic-like characters who take pleasure in just destroying, burning, and killing people. It's just something that they do. And the whole spiel about Goblin Slayer essentially becoming a goblin to the goblins, I thought was honestly kind of fascinating, and probably some of the best writing that I've actually seen from the series thus far. In terms of production value, animation, it's still not really reinventing the wheel or anything, but I have to admit that I really love the design of all these new characters who are getting ready to show up. They look really distinctive. The Archer girl in particular is awesome, and the show absolutely does not hold back on the fan service. Goblin Slayer's childhood friend is just stacked beyond belief, and they want you to know it all the freaking time. It comes across as a little cheesy and corny, but I still like the fact that his childhood friend still sees the good in Goblin Slayer and continues to wait for him every night, knowing that eventually he will return. There's also some really nice, striking imagery in the show. I like the fact that this fantasy world has two moons. There's a little red one and a giant blue one. Again, just making it seem a little more distinctive and trying to separate it from a ton of other different fantasy anime series. But this one right here was kind of a slow burn, but I really appreciate it, and I love the preview of getting to see all these new characters in the intro and finally seeing them in the post-credit scene. I'm hyped to see where the story is actually going to be going from here. I think Goblin Slayer could very well go down as a massive cult classic, and that's why I'm going to give this episode a 4 out of 5. You guys definitely need to check out this episode of Goblin Slayer, and if any of you guys did watch the episode, tell me what you thought about it in the comment section below. Thank you guys for watching this review. I'll see you all next time, and as always, stay down, baby.